Good evening. And before you close your eyes tonight, let me ask you something. Imagine wandering through a silent rainforest where enormous stone pyramids suddenly emerge from the trees. Once, these temples overlooked crowded cities filled with kings, merchants, astronomers, and millions of people. Today, the jungle has swallowed almost everything. How could one of the most brilliant civilizations in the ancient world simply fade away? Did the Maya disappear, or is the truth far more surprising? Tonight, we'll uncover their extraordinary story, one quiet step at a time. As you settle in and let the day drift away, we'll travel back more than 3,000 years to the forests of ancient Central America. Together, we'll witness the birth of the Maya civilization, its astonishing rise, its greatest achievements, and the long, gradual transformation that changed its world forever. So, take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let our journey begin.
For thousands of years before the first Maya king ever placed a jade crown upon his head, before the first towering pyramid reached above the trees, and before scribes carved royal histories into smooth blocks of limestone, the forests of Central America were already alive with quiet stories. If you could travel back nearly 4,000 years, you would find no magnificent cities waiting to welcome you. There would be no enormous temples, no grand palaces, and no crowded marketplaces echoing with the voices of thousands. Instead, you would step into a world where nature ruled almost everything. Towering ceiba trees stretched high into the sky, their branches forming a green roof that filtered the sunlight into soft patches across the forest floor. Thick vines twisted around ancient trunks, while colorful parrots called from above. Monkeys leapt effortlessly through the canopy, and somewhere in the distance, the deep growl of a jaguar reminded every living creature who truly ruled the jungle. This landscape covered much of what we now know as southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, western Honduras, and parts of El Salvador. Although we often think of it as one single rainforest, it was actually a remarkable collection of different environments. To the south rose volcanic mountains wrapped in cool mist. Their fertile slopes supported countless varieties of plants, nourished by rich volcanic soil that had formed over thousands of years. Farther north lay vast limestone plains, where rivers were surprisingly rare. Rainwater disappeared quickly beneath the porous rock, leaving behind hidden underground rivers and deep natural sinkholes known today as cenotes. For the people who lived here, every landscape demanded different skills. Some communities settled beside dependable rivers where fresh water flowed throughout the year. Others learned to survive in places where finding water required careful observation and generations of accumulated knowledge. They studied the clouds, remembered seasonal rainfall, and understood exactly where precious water could still be found during the hottest months. Long before written history, these early inhabitants became experts in reading the natural world. Each sunrise brought new decisions: which trail offered the freshest animal tracks, which fruit trees were ripening, which plants could heal an illness, and which should never be touched. Children learnt these lessons by walking beside parents and grandparents, listening far more than speaking. Every journey through the forest became another lesson passed from one generation to the next. Life was neither easy nor predictable. The rainy season transformed the forests into a world overflowing with life. Streams swelled with rushing water, flowers bloomed across the landscape, and animals became easier to find. Yet the dry season brought very different challenges. Waterholes shrank, hunting became more difficult, and families needed to rely on careful planning rather than good fortune. Patience became one of their greatest strengths.
At first, these communities lived mainly as hunter-gatherers. They hunted deer, peccaries, rabbits, wild turkey, and smaller animals using carefully crafted stone-tipped spears and atlatls, throwing tools that gave remarkable speed and distance to their weapons. Fishing provided another dependable source of food wherever rivers and lakes allowed it. The forests themselves offered remarkable abundance. Wild avocados, cacao pods, squash, chili peppers, palm fruits, edible roots, herbs, and honey collected from stingless bees all contributed to daily life. Nothing was wasted. Animal bones became tools, plant fibers became baskets and ropes. Even broken stones often found new purposes. To modernize, their possessions might seem simple, yet simplicity often reflected deep understanding rather than limitation. These people knew the rhythm of the land better than anyone could have imagined. Then, slowly, so slowly that no single generation could truly notice it, everything began to change. Somewhere along the way, families observed that seeds dropped near their camps sometimes grew into healthy plants the following season. Over many centuries, careful observation became deliberate cultivation. Instead of only gathering food from the forest, they began helping the forest produce food where they wanted it. Among all the plants they nurtured, one would eventually shape the destiny of an entire civilization: maize. The earliest ears of maize looked nothing like the large golden corn we know today. They were much smaller, the result of generations of careful selection by countless anonymous farmers whose names have long been forgotten. Each season they chose the strongest seeds, unknowingly transforming a wild grass into one of humanity's greatest crops. As maize improved, something remarkable happened. Families no longer needed to move quite so often. Small clearings appeared within the forest, where trees were carefully cut back and burned. The ash enriched the soil, creating fertile fields where maize grew alongside beans and squash. Modern historians sometimes call these the Three Sisters, because each crop helped the others thrive. Beans restored nutrients to the soil, squash spread across the ground to reduce weeds and preserve moisture, while maize provided sturdy stalks that supported climbing bean vines. Without realizing it, these early farmers were creating an agricultural system that could support far larger communities than hunting and gathering alone ever could. Villages slowly became more permanent. Simple homes built from wooden poles, woven branches, and thick thatched roofs began standing in the same places year after year. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires each morning. Children played between the houses, while elders repaired baskets, sharpened stone tools, or shared stories that explained the world around them. These stories became just as important as food. The people believed that every mountain, river, tree, and cave possessed its own spirit. Nature was not something separate from human life, it was part of it. The forest provided shelter, food, medicine, and mystery. Respecting its balance was simply another part of surviving. As generations passed, these villages continued to grow. No one living there could have imagined that their grandchildren's descendants would someday build some of the greatest cities in the ancient Americas. No one could yet picture towering pyramids rising above the jungle canopy, or kings whose names would be carved forever in stone. But the first foundations had already been laid, not with limestone blocks, but with patience, cooperation, and thousands of quiet decisions made by ordinary people. And as these villages became larger and more connected, new ideas, new leaders, and new ambitions would soon begin to transform this peaceful landscape into the birthplace of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. The changes came so gradually that no one living through them could have recognized the beginning of a new age. One generation built a few more homes than the last. The next cleared slightly larger fields. Children grew into adults who remembered a village that had once been only half its current size. Life still followed the rhythm of sunrise and sunset, planting and harvest, rain and drought. Yet beneath these familiar patterns, something extraordinary was quietly unfolding. By around 2000 BC, many communities across the Maya world had become permanently settled. Unlike their ancestors who often moved in search of food, these families remained close to their fields year after year. Their houses were modest but carefully constructed. Thick wooden posts supported walls woven from branches and coated with smooth clay. Roofs of palm leaves shed the heavy tropical rain surprisingly well, keeping the inside cool during the hottest afternoons. At the center of each home burned a small cooking fire. Every morning, before the forest was fully awake, smoke drifted lazily into the air as women prepared the day's first meal. Fresh maize was soaked, ground into soft dough using heavy stone grinding tools, then shaped into simple flat cakes before being cooked over warm stones. Beans simmered slowly in clay pots, while squash, peppers, herbs, and seasonal fruits completed meals that had changed little over countless generations. Food was never taken for granted. Every successful harvest represented months of careful work. Entire families planted together, weeded together, and harvested together. Even young children learned to scatter seeds, pull unwanted plants from the fields, and protect growing crops from hungry animals. Maize stood at the center of everything. It fed families, but it also became part of how they understood themselves. According to Maya beliefs recorded many centuries later, the gods did not create human beings from stone or clay. Instead, after several unsuccessful attempts, they finally formed people from maize dough. To the Maya, corn was not simply something they ate, it was what they believed they were made of. As villages expanded, people no longer needed every individual to produce food. Some became expert potters, shaping elegant clay vessels that were stronger and more beautiful than anything made before. Others learned to carve wood, polish stone, weave cotton into colorful clothing, or fashion ornaments from shells gathered along distant coastlines. For the first time, true specialization began to appear. With specialization came trade. A family living near the coast possessed resources unavailable far inland. Salt collected from shallow coastal pools became especially valuable, preserving food and adding flavor to meals. Fishermen traded dried fish and shells for obsidian, a volcanic glass so sharp it could slice through flesh more cleanly than many modern steel blades. Obsidian did not exist naturally across most Maya lands. Instead, it arrived from distant volcanic regions through networks of traders who traveled enormous distances on foot. There were no horses to ride, no oxen pulling carts, and no wheeled wagons carrying heavy loads through the forest. Everything moved because people carried it. Strong backs became the engines of commerce. Day after day, traders followed narrow forest paths linking one settlement to another. They carried jade stones from mountain valleys, brilliant feathers from tropical birds, cacao beans, woven textiles, pottery, seashells, salt, obsidian, and stories. Stories traveled just as easily as goods. A traveler arriving from a distant village might describe unfamiliar customs, new farming methods, unusual ceremonies, or rumors of prosperous communities beyond the next mountain range. Every journey spread ideas that slowly connected hundreds of separate villages into something larger. At first, these settlements were equals. Most villages remained relatively small, and no single family held overwhelming power. Important decisions were often guided by respected elders, whose wisdom came from experience rather than wealth. Their authority rested upon trust built over many years. But larger communities required greater organization. Someone needed to decide when new fields should be cleared. Someone had to organize communal building projects, settle disagreements, and oversee ceremonies asking the spirits for rain or successful harvests. Leadership slowly became more permanent. Certain families earned greater respect than others. Perhaps they consistently organized successful harvests. Perhaps they possessed unusual spiritual knowledge. Perhaps they simply proved especially skilled at bringing people together during difficult times. Whatever the reason, the first seeds of political leadership had been planted. Alongside these emerging leaders stood individuals whose influence reached beyond everyday life. These were the earliest spiritual guides. They carefully observed the rising and setting of the sun, in the way modern science does, but they recognized patterns with astonishing patience. Those patterns became deeply meaningful. If planting happened at the wrong time, harvests could fail. If ceremonies ignored the changing seasons, people feared the balance between humanity and nature might be disturbed. So the sky itself became a calendar. Every sunrise offered information. Every full moon carried meaning. Every season reminded people that their lives were connected to forces far greater than themselves. As villages continued growing, the open spaces at their centers also changed. Simple gathering places gradually became carefully prepared ceremonial areas. Families came together during festivals to celebrate harvests, honor ancestors, exchange goods, and strengthen friendships with neighboring communities. Music filled the air. Drums echoed softly through the forest. Shell trumpets announced important ceremonies. The scent of roasting food drifted between houses while children laughed beneath the evening sky. These celebrations did more than entertain. They created a shared identity. People who had once thought only of their own small village slowly began seeing themselves as part of a much larger cultural world. No one could yet imagine the magnificent cities of Tikal, Calakmul, or Palenque. Those wonders still belonged to the distant future, but the invisible foundations of those great kingdoms were already taking shape. Agriculture had created stability. Trade had connected distant communities. Leadership had begun to emerge. Religion had united people through shared beliefs. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the first true ceremonial centers were beginning to rise from the forests, places where simple villages would soon transform into the earliest cities of the Maya world, changing history in ways no one could yet foresee. For many generations, the villages of the Maya had grown quietly, almost unnoticed by the wider world. Farmers harvested their maize, traders followed familiar forest paths, and families gathered beneath thatched roofs as the seasons came and went. But as communities became larger and wealthier, something began to change. People started building not only for survival, but for memory. The first ceremonial platforms appeared in the centers of growing settlements. At first, they were simple mounds of packed earth, raised only a few feet above the surrounding ground. To modernize, they might seem unremarkable, but to the people who built them, these platforms represented something entirely new. They were places where the earthly world met the sacred one. Standing upon them, priests could address the community. Ceremonies could be seen by everyone gathered below. Offerings could be made closer to the heavens, while the smoke from burning incense drifted upward through the warm tropical air. Over time, each new generation expanded what the previous one had built. Instead of tearing down old structures, they often covered them with fresh layers of stone and earth, creating larger platforms that preserved the older buildings inside, like memories carefully wrapped away.
Centuries later, archaeologists would discover entire temples hidden within newer temples, each one preserving the work of ancestors long forgotten. The settlements themselves were changing shape.
Rather than houses spreading randomly through the forest, important buildings began gathering around wide-open plazas. These plazas became the heart of community life. During ordinary days, they served as meeting places where traders exchanged goods, children played, and neighbors shared news. But during festivals, they transformed into vast ceremonial spaces filled with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. Imagine arriving at one of these early ceremonial centers. As the morning mist slowly lifted from the forest, families would begin arriving from villages many miles away. Some carried woven baskets filled with maize or cacao beans. Others brought pottery, brightly colored feathers, or finely carved stone tools to trade. Children stared in amazement at sights they rarely saw. Musicians played steady rhythms upon wooden drums. The deep sound echoed across the plaza. The sweet scent of burning copal incense drifted through the air, mixing with the aroma of fresh food cooking over small fires. For many people, these gatherings were about far more than commerce. They were opportunities to strengthen friendships, arrange marriages between distant families, settle disagreements peacefully, and honor the gods who were believed to guide every part of life. As the settlements prospered, another precious material began appearing more frequently: jade. Unlike gold, which the Maya valued surprisingly little, jade held enormous spiritual significance. Its deep green color reminded people of fresh plants after rainfall, new life, fertile fields, and the promise of future harvests. Finding jade was difficult. Only certain regions contained the beautiful green stone, making every piece valuable. Skilled craftsmen spent countless hours shaping it with remarkable patience, using little more than sand, water, and harder stones to slowly grind each ornament into its final form. There were no metal chisels, no steel blades, no machines. Every polished bead represented weeks of careful work. The finest jade ornaments became symbols of authority. Leaders wore necklaces of polished green stones. Priests carried carved jade objects during ceremonies. Families treasured small pieces that passed from one generation to the next, each carrying memories as valuable as the stone itself. At the same time, artists were becoming increasingly skilled. Potters decorated their vessels with graceful curves and carefully painted designs inspired by birds, jaguars, snakes, flowers, and the natural world surrounding them. Stone carvers experimented with new techniques, slowly learning how to transform rough limestone into smooth monuments that could last for centuries. Art was never created simply for decoration. Every image carried meaning. A serpent might symbolize wisdom or the connection between heaven and earth. A jaguar represented strength, power, and the mysterious darkness of the night. Birds soaring high above the forest reminded people of the heavens where many gods were believed to reside.
Nature remained their greatest teacher. Meanwhile, the leaders of larger settlements discovered that organizing hundreds of people required more than respect alone. Building even a modest ceremonial platform demanded enormous cooperation. Trees first had to be cleared, heavy stones collected, earth moved basket by basket, wooden beams carried into place, food prepared for the workers. Every successful project strengthened the authority of those who organized it. Gradually, Leadership became something that could be inherited.
Children born into respected families often grew up expecting to guide their communities one day. Although the powerful royal dynasties of later centuries had not yet fully emerged, the foundations of kingship were beginning to take shape. Religion and leadership became closely connected. The people believed that their leaders possessed a special relationship with the gods, allowing them to perform ceremonies that protected the community and maintained harmony between humanity and the natural world. If the rains arrived on time, if the harvest proved abundant, if disease remained rare, many believed it reflected the success of these sacred rituals. But such responsibility also carried great pressure. A failed harvest could raise difficult questions.
A long drought might cause people to wonder whether the gods were displeased. Leadership required constant effort, not only in governing daily life, but also in preserving hope during uncertain times. Far beyond these growing ceremonial centers, countless smaller villages continued their peaceful routines. Most people never imagined that they were living through the earliest chapters of one of history's greatest civilizations. To them, tomorrow would look much like today. Fields would need tending, children would need teaching, meals would need preparing. Yet with every passing generation, the ceremonial centers grew larger. The plazas became wider. The temples reached higher. Trade routes stretched farther through the forests.
And slowly, almost imperceptibly, these sacred gathering places began evolving into something entirely new. The first true Maya cities were beginning to emerge, and with them would come powerful rulers, magnificent monuments, and a civilization whose achievements would one day astonish the world. As the first true Maya cities continued to grow, life settled into a comforting rhythm. Long before the sun climbed above the rainforest, while the morning sky was still painted in deep shades of blue and violet, the cities were already beginning to wake. Somewhere in the darkness, a rooster called. A dog barked in the distance. The gentle crackling of cooking fires drifted through the cool morning air. One by one, small homes lit up, as families quietly prepared for another ordinary day.
Unlike the towering stone palaces reserved for rulers and nobles, most Maya families lived in simple houses built from wooden poles, woven branches, and thick walls coated with clay. Their roofs were covered with tightly packed palm leaves that protected them from the heavy tropical rains. Inside, there was very little furniture. People often slept on woven reed mats spread across the floor. A few clay pots rested near the cooking fire. Stone grinding tools leaned against the wall. Everything inside the house had a purpose. Nothing unnecessary occupied precious space. As the eastern horizon slowly brightened, women began preparing the day's first meal. The familiar sound of stone grinding against stone echoed softly through the village. Corn kernels, soaked overnight until they became soft, were carefully ground into smooth dough, using heavy stone metates that had often been passed down through generations.
The work demanded patience, back and forth, again and again. Every morning, fresh tortillas were cooked over warm clay griddles, while beans simmered gently nearby. Sometimes the meal included squash, chili peppers, tomatoes, or avocado. If the previous day's hunting had been successful, there might also be fish, turkey, or venison. To the Maya, breakfast was not rushed. It prepared both body and spirit for the long hours ahead. As families finished eating, the city slowly filled with movement. Farmers gathered their simple tools and began walking towards the fields beyond the city. Craftsmen opened small workshops where they carved jade, shaped pottery, or polished obsidian blades.
Merchants unpacked baskets filled with goods collected from distant regions. Children followed their parents, watching carefully as they learned the skills they would one day inherit. There were no formal schools for most children. Education happened through observation.
A young boy might spend years walking beside his father, learning how to recognize healthy maize, repair fishing nets, or carve wood. A young girl often learned cooking, weaving, pottery, and household management by working alongside her mother, grandmother, and older sisters. Knowledge lived within families. Every lesson came through experience. By mid-morning, the surrounding fields were alive with activity. The Maya were remarkable farmers. Their survival depended upon understanding both the land and the changing seasons. Most families cultivated maize alongside beans and squash, creating a balanced system that protected the soil while producing dependable harvests. But farming in a tropical rainforest was never easy. The forest constantly tried to reclaim every clearing.
Vines spread quickly. Trees produced endless seeds. Heavy rains washed away loose soil. Every year required fresh effort. Farmers carefully observed the sky. Dark clouds promised welcome rain. Too much rain threatened flooding. Too little meant drought. Their lives remained closely tied to nature, just as their ancestors had experienced centuries before. Back inside the city, another world bustled with quiet energy. The marketplace had become one of the busiest places in Maya society. There was no money as we think of it today. Instead, people exchanged goods through trade. A farmer carrying fresh maize might return home with beautifully painted pottery. A fisherman offered dried fish in exchange for woven cloth.
Salt, cacao beans, obsidian blades, honey, feathers, medicinal herbs, cotton textiles, and carved ornaments changed hands throughout the day. The marketplace was more than a place to buy and sell. It was where news traveled. Travelers described distant cities. Merchants spoke of successful harvests hundreds of miles away. Rumors spread about ambitious rulers, unusual ceremonies, or dangerous conflicts developing far beyond the horizon. For many people, this was the closest thing to a newspaper. As the afternoon heat settled over the city, work slowed slightly. The tropical sun became almost unbearable. Families rested briefly beneath shaded roofs while children played nearby. Laughter drifted through the warm air. Dogs wandered lazily between houses.
Brightly colored macaws circled overhead before disappearing into the forest canopy. Life could feel surprisingly peaceful. Yet above this ordinary world stood another level of society. Nobles lived in larger homes closer to the ceremonial center. They wore finely woven cotton clothing decorated with colorful feathers and precious jade jewelry. Their responsibilities were very different from those of farmers. They advised rulers, supervised construction projects, collected tribute, and organized important ceremonies. Priests also occupied a respected position within Maya society. Their work extended far beyond religion. They carefully observed the stars. They recorded important dates. They calculated the changing seasons and advised leaders about the proper times for planting, ceremonies, and public events. To many ordinary people, the priests seemed to possess knowledge that bordered on magic. But much of that knowledge came from generations of careful observation. As evening approached, families returned home. The city slowly became quieter. Cooking fires once again filled the air with the comforting smell of warm maize and roasted vegetables. Neighbors gathered outside their homes to share stories after another day's work. Children listened as grandparents retold ancient legends about gods, heroic ancestors, and the creation of the world.
These stories entertained. They also taught. Every generation inherited not only land and tools, but also memories. Above them, the stars slowly appeared one by one. Few civilizations in the ancient world watched the night sky as carefully as the Maya. To most families, the stars were beautiful. To priests and scholars, they were something even greater. They were a vast celestial calendar waiting to be understood. And before long, that careful study of the heavens would allow the Maya to achieve discoveries so astonishing that historians still marvel at them today.
As darkness settled over the Maya cities, most families prepared to sleep. Cooking fires faded into glowing embers. The sounds of busy marketplaces disappeared. Even the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if the entire world were taking a slow, gentle breath. But while much of the city rested, a few people climbed the steep stone stairways leading to the tops of temples. They carried no telescopes, no clocks, no maps of the heavens, only generations of patience, remarkable memories, and a determination to understand the sky above them. Night after night, year after year, they watched. The stars became their teachers. They noticed that certain constellations appeared during the same season every year. They watched the moon slowly change its shape from a thin silver crescent to a brilliant full circle before fading away once more. They followed the wandering path of bright planets across the heavens, especially Venus, whose movements fascinated Maya astronomers more than almost anything else in the night sky. To modern people, these lights might seem distant and silent. To the Maya, they were part of a living universe. The heavens were not separate from life on Earth. They believed that everything was connected. The rising sun warmed the maize fields. The arrival of seasonal stars signaled the time to plant. The changing moon influenced ceremonies and sacred festivals. Understanding the sky meant understanding life itself.
Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Maya did not simply admire the heavens. They measured them, carefully, patiently, sometimes for generations. Imagine a young apprentice standing beside an elderly priest. Every clear evening, they would watch the same point on the horizon where the sun disappeared. The elder would quietly mark its position. The apprentice would remember. Tomorrow they would return, then the next evening, and the next. Months became years, years became decades. Eventually, patterns emerged that only extraordinary patience could reveal. The Maya realized that the movements of the heavens followed dependable cycles.
Nothing happened by accident. The universe moved with quiet precision. That understanding transformed their civilization. From these observations came one of the most accurate calendar systems of the ancient world. In fact, the Maya used several calendars at the same time, each serving a different purpose. One calendar guided everyday life. Another determined sacred ceremonies. A much longer calendar recorded the passage of great stretches of history, allowing important events to be remembered across centuries. To us, managing several calendars at once might seem confusing. To the Maya, it brought order to the universe. Every important decision could be connected to time. When should crops be planted? When should a temple be dedicated? When should a ruler hold a great ceremony?
The answers were written not on paper, but in the movements of the heavens. Yet keeping track of such complicated cycles required something equally remarkable: numbers. Many ancient civilizations developed impressive systems of mathematics.
The Maya created one that was astonishingly elegant. Instead of relying only on long strings of symbols, they used a simple combination of dots and bars. A single dot represented 1, a horizontal bar represented 5. These few symbols could express surprisingly large numbers with remarkable clarity. But perhaps their greatest mathematical achievement was something so familiar today that we rarely stop to appreciate it. The Maya developed a symbol representing 0. 0. It seems ordinary now. Children learn about it in school without giving it much thought. Yet in much of the ancient world, 0 either did not exist or was used only in very limited ways. The Maya understood that nothing could itself be represented as something meaningful. This simple idea allowed them to perform calculations that would have been extraordinarily difficult using many other ancient numbering systems. Their calendars became more accurate. Their astronomical records became more precise. Their understanding of long periods of time became far more sophisticated. Knowledge itself became easier to preserve. Preserving that knowledge required another extraordinary invention: writing. The Maya created one of the few fully developed writing systems ever invented independently in human history. Their script was unlike our alphabet. Instead of arranging simple letters into words, Maya scribes used hundreds of beautifully carved glyphs. Some represented complete words, others represented sounds. Combined together, they formed an elegant and remarkably flexible language, carved into stone, painted onto pottery, and written inside folded books made from the bark of fig trees. Learning to read and write was not easy. Only specially trained scribes mastered the system. Years of careful study were required. Every glyph had to be drawn with precision. A small mistake could completely change the meaning. These scribes became the historians of Maya civilization. They recorded royal births, victories in battle, religious ceremonies, important alliances, the movements of the planets, the passing of time itself.
Thanks to their careful work, voices from more than 1,000 years ago can still speak to us today. When archaeologists finally learned to read many of these glyphs in the 20th century, the silent ruins suddenly began telling their stories again. Kings whose names had been forgotten for centuries spoke once more. Cities revealed their histories. Entire dynasties emerged from silence. Knowledge became one of the greatest treasures in Maya society. Yet wisdom alone could not build enormous temples. Mathematics could not raise vast stone pyramids. Writing could not organize thousands of workers. Something else was happening at the very same time.
Across the Maya world, powerful rulers were gaining greater authority than ever before. Their cities were expanding rapidly. Their ambitions were growing even faster. Before long, the forests would witness the rise of magnificent capitals whose soaring temples would dominate the landscape for centuries, announcing to every traveler that a new age of Maya power had truly begun. By the time the Maya had mastered farming, trade, mathematics, astronomy, and writing, their world had changed beyond recognition. The quiet farming villages of earlier centuries had grown into thriving cities. Some were home to only a few thousand people. Others supported populations that may have reached tens of thousands, making them among the largest urban centers anywhere in the ancient Americas. If you approached one of these cities after several days of walking through the rainforest, the first thing you would notice would not be the people.
It would be the skyline. Above the endless sea of green trees, pale limestone temples rose toward the heavens like mountains shaped by human hands. Their steep staircases caught the morning sunlight, making the buildings appear almost golden against the emerald forest. Long before you reached the city itself, you would already know you were approaching somewhere extraordinary. One of the greatest of these cities was Tikal. Hidden today beneath the jungles of northern Guatemala, Tikal was once one of the most powerful cities in the Maya world. At its height, thousands of people filled its plazas every day. Its temples soared more than 200 feet into the air.
Standing at the top, a ruler could look across an endless canopy of trees, broken only by the distant peaks of other temples rising from the forest many miles away. To modern visitors, it is difficult to imagine the sounds that once filled these silent ruins. The plazas would have echoed with conversation, music, merchants calling to customers, children laughing, priests chanting prayers, and workers carrying heavy baskets of stone and timber. The city was alive. Every building served a purpose. The enormous temples were places of ceremony, where rulers honored the gods and important religious festivals took place. Nearby stood royal palaces. Unlike the simple homes of ordinary families, these sprawling stone buildings contained dozens of rooms arranged around quiet courtyards.
Here, nobles discussed politics, scribes recorded history, and servants carried out the countless tasks needed to keep a royal household running smoothly. Around the ceremonial center stretched neighborhoods where craftsmen, merchants, and farmers lived. Although their homes remained modest, together they formed a busy and highly organized community. Roads connected different parts of the city. Wide open plazas allowed thousands of people to gather during festivals. Carefully planned reservoirs stored precious rainwater for the dry season. Building such a city required remarkable organization. There were no iron tools, no horses to pull heavy loads, no oxen dragging massive stones across the landscape. Everything depended on human effort. Workers cut enormous limestone blocks from nearby quarries, using stone tools that seem surprisingly simple by modern standards. The blocks were then carried, pushed, and carefully positioned by teams of laborers working together with extraordinary precision. It was slow work. A single building could take many years to complete. Some projects continued through the reigns of several kings, each ruler adding something new before passing the responsibility to his successor. Yet construction never truly stopped. Rather than replacing older temples, the Maya often built larger ones directly over them. Hidden beneath many of today's ruins are earlier buildings, preserved like layers of history waiting to be uncovered. Each generation quite literally built upon the achievements of the last. The white limestone itself gave the cities a striking appearance. Freshly cut stone reflected sunlight brilliantly. Many buildings were also covered with smooth white plaster and painted in vivid colors. Bright reds, deep blues, rich yellows. The cities we see today, weathered and grey, were once vibrant places filled with color. Towering stone carvings stood throughout the ceremonial centers. These monuments, known today as stelae, were much more than decoration. Each one told a story. Skilled artisans carved detailed images of rulers wearing magnificent feathered headdresses and elaborate jade jewelry. Alongside these images appeared rows of beautifully carved glyphs recording important events: a king's birth, his coronation, a military victory, the completion of a temple, an important religious ceremony. To the Maya, history was something meant to be remembered in stone. Visitors entering a city could read its past simply by walking through its plazas.
The rulers understood the power of these monuments. Every new temple and every carved stela reminded the people that their city was prosperous, protected, and favored by the gods. Of course, no great city stood alone. Across the Maya world, dozens of powerful kingdoms flourished at the same time.
Calakmul, hidden deep within the forests of present-day Mexico, became one of Tikal's greatest rivals. Palenque, farther west, grew famous for its elegant architecture and gifted artists. Copan, in what is now Honduras, became renowned for producing some of the most beautiful stone carvings ever created by the Maya. Each city possessed its own ruler, its own traditions, its own ambitions. Although they shared the same broad culture, language family, religion, and calendar systems, they were not united beneath a single emperor. Instead, the Maya world resembled a tapestry of independent kingdoms. Sometimes they traded peacefully, sometimes they formed alliances through marriage, and sometimes they prepared for war.
At first, competition remained mostly peaceful. Kings wanted their cities to build taller temples, create more beautiful monuments, and attract the finest artists and scholars. But success often brought pride. Pride inspired ambition, and ambition rarely remained satisfied for long. As one city grew stronger, its neighbors became uneasy. Trade routes became more valuable. Political alliances became more complicated. Rulers who had once exchanged gifts began watching one another with increasing suspicion. The magnificent cities that had transformed the Maya world into one of history's greatest civilizations were also becoming rivals, and before many generations had passed, the struggle for power between these proud kingdoms would shape the destiny of the Maya for centuries to come.
For generations, the great Maya cities had competed through beauty. One ruler built a taller temple. Another commissioned a more elaborate palace. A neighboring king unveiled a magnificent carved monument that celebrated his family's long history. Success was measured not only by wealth, but by the ability to inspire admiration. Yet admiration often carried an unwelcome companion: envy. As populations grew and cities became more powerful, the balance between cooperation and competition slowly began to shift. Trade routes that once connected friendly neighbors became strategic lifelines. The richest jade sources, the finest obsidian, the most fertile farmland, and the busiest marketplaces suddenly held far greater importance than they had before. Control over these resources meant greater prosperity.
Greater prosperity meant more workers. More workers meant larger temples, stronger armies, and greater influence. Power, once gained, had a way of demanding even more power. The rulers understood this better than anyone. Although each city possessed its own traditions and royal family, none existed in complete isolation. Messengers constantly traveled between kingdoms. Some carried gifts wrapped in brightly woven cloth. Others carried marriage proposals that united two royal families, and a few carried warnings. Diplomacy became an art. A carefully chosen marriage could secure peace for decades. A generous exchange of gifts might prevent a conflict before it began.
But one insult, one disputed border, one ambitious ruler determined to expand his influence could undo years of careful negotiation. Unlike the enormous standing armies of later empires, Maya warfare usually relied on highly trained warriors led by noble commanders. Most soldiers were ordinary men who returned to farming when campaigns ended. They did not spend every year fighting. Life still revolved around planting and harvesting, but when their king called, they answered. Preparing for war required weeks of careful planning. Weapons were inspected. Spears were fitted with freshly sharpened obsidian blades.
Wooden shields were repaired using animal hide and woven fibers. Cotton armor, surprisingly effective against many weapons, was carefully stitched together. The night before a campaign, ceremonies often filled the temples. Priests burned fragrant copal incense. Prayers echoed across the plazas. Offerings were presented to the gods, asking for protection, courage, and victory. Many warriors believed they carried not only the hopes of their ruler, but also the blessings of the heavens themselves. When dawn arrived, the army departed. There were no cavalry charging across open fields, no heavy wagons carrying supplies. The dense rainforest shaped every journey. Narrow forest paths forced warriors to march in long lines beneath towering trees.
The air was heavy with humidity. Birds scattered as hundreds of footsteps disturbed the quiet jungle. Progress was slow. Sometimes rivers had to be crossed. Sometimes steep hills delayed the march. Every campaign demanded endurance long before the first battle began. Contrary to what we often imagine, the primary goal of Maya warfare was not always to destroy cities. Capturing important people could be even more valuable. A defeated king, a respected noble, or a famous military commander brought home alive represented an extraordinary victory. Such captives strengthened the reputation of the victorious ruler while weakening the authority of his rival. Honor mattered enormously, so did reputation. Throughout the Maya world, kings carefully recorded their victories. Stone monuments proudly displayed scenes of defeated enemies kneeling before triumphant rulers. These carvings were more than celebrations, they were messages. Every traveler who entered the city could see them. Every neighboring kingdom understood their meaning. Our ruler is strong. Our gods favor us. Think carefully before challenging us. One of the greatest rivalries in Maya history developed between two extraordinary cities, Tikal and Chichén. Separated by dense forests, these two powerful kingdoms spent generations competing for influence. Sometimes they fought directly. More often, they supported different allies, drawing smaller kingdoms into an ever-changing web of political alliances.
Greater prosperity meant more workers. More workers meant larger temples, stronger armies, and greater influence. Power, once gained, had a way of demanding even more power. The rulers understood this better than anyone. Although each city possessed its own traditions and royal family, none existed in complete isolation. Messengers constantly traveled between kingdoms. Some carried gifts wrapped in brightly woven cloth. Others carried marriage proposals that united two royal families, and a few carried warnings. Diplomacy became an art. A carefully chosen marriage could secure peace for decades. A generous exchange of gifts might prevent a conflict before it began.
Yet even they could feel the consequences. When trade routes became unsafe, valuable goods arrived less often. When rulers demanded more workers for fortifications or monuments celebrating military victories, villages supplied labor. When harvests failed during years of conflict, food became harder to obtain. The decisions made inside royal palaces gradually reached every corner of society. And despite the growing tension, the Maya cities continued achieving extraordinary accomplishments. Artists created breathtaking sculptures. Astronomers refined their observations.
Architects designed even taller temples. The civilization appeared stronger than ever. From the outside, the Maya world looked almost unstoppable.
But beneath its magnificent temples and carefully carved monuments, small cracks had already begun to appear. Constant rivalry demanded enormous resources. Ambitious rulers expected endless growth. Cities competed not only for prestige, but for survival. Few people noticed these warning signs. After all, the plazas were still crowded. The harvests still filled the granaries. The temples still reached proudly towards the heavens. Yet history often changes quietly before anyone realizes it. And while the kings celebrated their victories in stone, nature itself was preparing challenges that no army, no matter how powerful, could ever hope to defeat.
For a time, it seemed as though nothing could stop the Maya. The cities continued to grow. Their rulers commissioned even taller temples. Artists filled palace walls with brilliant paintings. Merchants carried valuable goods across hundreds of miles of forests, rivers, and mountains. To those living during these centuries, the future must have appeared full of endless possibility. Historians now call this period the Classic Age of the Maya. It was an age of confidence, an age when knowledge, craftsmanship, architecture, and political power all reached extraordinary heights. Across the rainforest, dozens of independent kingdoms flourished at the same time. Each one sought greatness in its own way.
Some became famous for military victories, others for magnificent temples. Some were celebrated for gifted artists and skilled scribes. Others earned respect through prosperous trade and wise leadership. Although no single emperor ruled them all, together they formed one of the most sophisticated civilizations anywhere in the ancient world. If you had visited one of the great cities during its golden age, you would have witnessed a place bursting with life. The plazas were rarely empty. Merchants arrived at sunrise carrying woven baskets balanced carefully upon their backs. Women spread colorful textiles across market stalls. Potters displayed elegant painted vessels beside polished obsidian blades that reflected the morning light. The air carried countless familiar scents: fresh tortillas cooking over clay griddles, roasted cacao beans, sweet tropical fruits, the sharp fragrance of copal incense drifting from nearby temples. Above everything rose the steady sound of conversation. Thousands of voices blended together into a gentle hum that echoed between the great stone buildings. Trade connected nearly every corner of the Maya world. From the volcanic highlands came obsidian, prized for its razor-sharp edges. Mountain valleys supplied precious jade. The coast provided salt, seashells, dried fish, and stingray spines used in sacred ceremonies. Deep forests yielded jaguar skins, exotic feathers, hardwood timber, medicinal plants, and fragrant resins. Nothing traveled quickly. There were still no horses, no carts, no wagons. Every valuable object crossed the landscape because someone carried it. Professional merchants spent much of their lives walking. Some journeys lasted weeks, others stretched into months. They crossed rivers in simple canoes. They climbed steep mountain paths. They slept beneath the stars before continuing their journeys at first light. These travelers became more than merchants. They carried news between distant kingdoms. They spread new artistic styles. They introduced unfamiliar ideas. Sometimes they even warned cities of political changes unfolding far beyond the horizon.
In many ways, they were the invisible threads that held the Maya world together. Prosperity transformed daily life.
Families could afford beautifully painted pottery instead of plain cooking vessels. Cotton clothing became softer and more colorful. Jewelry crafted from jade, shell, and polished stone appeared during festivals and ceremonies. Music became increasingly important. Drums echoed through city plazas. Flutes carved from bone and clay produced soft melodies. Shell trumpets announced the arrival of important visitors or the beginning of sacred rituals. Festivals filled the calendar. Some celebrated successful harvests. Others honored important gods.
Many mark the completion of great building projects or the anniversary of royal victories. These gatherings brought thousands of people together. Markets expanded. Stories were shared. Marriages were arranged. Old friendships were renewed. For ordinary families, these celebrations provided welcome breaks from the demanding work of farming and craftsmanship. The rulers also understood the importance of public ceremony. Every appearance became a carefully planned display of authority. When a king emerged from his palace, he wore magnificent clothing unlike anything seen in everyday life. His towering headdress shimmered with brilliant quetzal feathers.
Heavy jade necklaces rested across his chest. Intricately woven fabrics displayed symbols of royal power. To the people watching from the plaza below, he represented more than a political leader. He embodied the stability of the kingdom itself. Scribes stood nearby, recording important events. Artists prepared sketches for future monuments. Musicians filled the air with steady rhythms. Everything reminded the people that their city was prosperous, organized, and protected. Yet beneath this magnificent display stood thousands of ordinary workers whose names history would never remember. Stonecutters patiently shaped limestone blocks beneath the tropical sun. Builders carried enormous loads across construction sites. Farmers produced the food that sustained the entire population.
Potters, weavers, hunters, fishermen, and merchants all contributed to the success of their cities. Without them, no temple could rise, no palace could function, no king could rule. Great civilizations are rarely built by famous individuals alone. They are built by countless ordinary people whose quiet work often goes unnoticed. As the cities flourished, so did the arts. Walls inside royal buildings came alive with colorful murals showing court life, ceremonies, musicians, dancers, warriors, and noble families. Master sculptors carved breathtaking monuments filled with astonishing detail. Even today, historians marvel at the realism of Maya faces carved into stone more than 1,000 years ago. These were not anonymous figures.
They were portraits, real rulers, real families, real moments captured forever. The Maya seemed to have achieved an extraordinary balance. Agriculture fed growing populations, trade connected distant kingdoms, astronomy guided their calendars, writing preserved their history, architecture displayed their power, art celebrated their identity. For generations, the system appeared remarkably successful. If someone living during this golden age had been asked whether their civilization would one day decline, the question might have seemed almost impossible to imagine.
The temples had never stood taller. The cities had never been wealthier. The kings had never appeared more powerful. But history often hides its greatest turning points beneath the surface. While festivals filled the plazas and merchants continued their long journeys through the rainforest, the forests themselves were beginning to change. The growing population demanded more farmland. More temples required more limestone. More houses required more timber. The land that had patiently supported the Maya for centuries
was slowly being asked to give more than ever before. At first, almost no one noticed. The changes were subtle. A few more trees disappeared each year. Fields stretched a little further into the forest. Reservoirs needed to hold a little more water. One unusually dry season passed. Then another. Individually, these changes seemed unimportant. Together, they were quietly reshaping the future of an entire civilization. And before long, the first signs of that transformation would become impossible for anyone to ignore. No civilization wakes up one morning and suddenly discovers that it is falling. The end rarely arrives with a single dramatic moment. Instead, it begins quietly, so quietly that most people never realize they are living through the first chapter of a great transformation. For the Maya, the warning signs did not appear in royal palaces. They appeared in the forests.
For centuries, the rainforest had seemed endless. Towering trees stretched beyond the horizon. Wild animals remained plentiful. Fresh wood was always available for new homes, cooking fires, temples, and lime kilns used to produce the white plaster that covered Maya buildings. It was easy to believe the forest could provide forever. But every growing city demanded more. Each magnificent temple required thousands of limestone blocks. Those blocks were then covered with smooth white plaster, a process that required enormous quantities of firewood. Tree after tree disappeared into the blazing kilns. At first, no one worried. The surrounding jungle still looked vast.
Whenever one area was cleared, another stood waiting beyond it. Yet with every passing generation, the distance to untouched forests grew a little longer. Woodcutters had to walk farther than their fathers had, then farther still. It was such a gradual change that few people stopped to think about what it might mean. The expanding population created another challenge. Every new family needed land. More mouths required more maize. More maize demanded more fields. Across the Maya world, forests were carefully cleared to make room for agriculture. For many years, this system worked remarkably well. Freshly cleared land produced excellent harvests.
Ash from burned vegetation enriched the soil. Families prospered. Villages expanded. Cities continued to grow. But tropical soils are delicate. Unlike the rich farmland found in some other parts of the world, much of the rainforest's fertility exists not deep within the earth, but in the living forest itself. Once the trees disappeared, heavy rains gradually washed precious nutrients away. Fields that had once produced abundant harvests became less productive. Farmers responded the only way they knew. They cleared new land. Again and again. The cycle repeated itself. As populations continued increasing, finding untouched forest became more difficult.
Some families now cultivated fields that were less fertile than those of earlier generations. Harvests remained good enough, but not always as plentiful as before. No single poor harvest would destroy a civilization. The Maya had survived difficult years before. They stored food, they adapted, they endured. But several difficult years in close succession created growing pressure. At the same time, another challenge emerged from the sky itself. The rains became less predictable. For people living in modern cities, a dry season might simply mean watering gardens more often. For the Maya, rainfall determined almost everything.
Without dependable rain, reservoirs slowly emptied. Small streams disappeared. The soil hardened beneath the relentless tropical sun. Young maize struggled to grow. The priests continued observing the heavens. Ceremonies became more frequent.
Offerings were made with sincere hope that the balance between humanity and the gods would soon be restored. Ordinary families watched the skies every afternoon. Dark clouds gathered. Sometimes they drifted away without releasing a single drop. Children who had once splashed happily in seasonal pools now found dry earth where water should have been. No one knew exactly why the rains seemed different.
Today, scientists studying lake sediments, cave formations, and ancient climate records have found evidence that parts of the Maya world experienced periods of prolonged drought. These dry years did not arrive all at once. They came in waves. One difficult season, then several better ones, then another drought. Each challenge left communities a little more vulnerable than before. The cities still looked magnificent. Their temples still dominated the skyline. Visitors arriving from distant kingdoms could still admire bustling marketplaces and crowded plazas. From the outside, prosperity appeared unchanged.
But beneath that appearance, daily life was becoming harder. Farmers worked longer hours. Reservoirs required constant maintenance. Food had to be distributed more carefully. Leaders faced increasingly difficult decisions. Should more workers build another temple? Or should they repair water systems? Should tribute continue flowing into royal construction projects? Or should more resources remain with struggling villages? There were no easy answers. Meanwhile, competition between kingdoms had not disappeared. Even as nature created new challenges, rival rulers continued seeking greater prestige.
Wars still erupted. Alliances still shifted. Victorious kings still celebrated their achievements with magnificent monuments. Yet every military campaign consumed food. Every army required healthy young workers. Every conflict placed additional strain upon communities already adapting to changing conditions. For ordinary people, the burden grew heavier. A farmer might return from weeks of labor helping construct a royal monument, only to discover that his own fields needed urgent attention. A craftsman asked to produce gifts for a noble family still had to provide for his children. The demands of everyday life never paused. Even so, the Maya remained remarkably resilient. They were skilled engineers.
They expanded reservoirs. They experimented with new farming techniques. Communities supported one another whenever possible. Again and again, they adapted. For many years, adaptation was enough. The civilization did not collapse overnight. It bent without breaking. But every great tree has a limit to how much pressure it can bear. And slowly, almost invisibly, the foundations that had supported the Maya world for centuries were beginning to weaken. Soon, those quiet cracks would spread from the forests into the royal palaces themselves, where even the most powerful kings would discover that some challenges could no longer be solved by authority alone.
For generations, the great Maya cities had seemed almost eternal. Their temples stood high above the rainforest. Their plazas welcomed merchants from distant kingdoms. Their rulers carved victories into stone, believing their names would be remembered forever. But even the strongest civilizations are shaped by the choices they make during difficult times. And now, those difficult times were becoming impossible to ignore. The first signs were easy to overlook. A marketplace that felt a little quieter than usual. A neighborhood where a few houses stood empty. A temple construction project that paused longer than expected. None of these changes seemed extraordinary on their own.
Life continued. Children still played in the plazas. Farmers still walked to their fields before sunrise. Priests still climbed temple stairways to greet the dawn. Yet beneath these familiar routines,
Something had begun to unravel. In many cities, harvests no longer produced the abundance they once had. Food became less predictable. Some families found themselves storing every handful of maize they could spare, uncertain what the following season might bring. Parents quietly ate smaller portions so their children could eat a little more. No royal monument recorded these sacrifices. History carved into stone usually celebrated victories, not worries whispered around evening fires.
As resources became scarcer, competition intensified. Neighboring kingdoms that had once exchanged gifts now argued over farmland, water sources, and important trade routes. Small conflicts became larger ones. Old rivalries returned with renewed determination. For ambitious rulers, military success offered an opportunity to prove strength during uncertain times. If crops were failing, a victory in battle might restore confidence. If people questioned their leadership, another magnificent monument might remind everyone of the king's greatness. But monuments could not fill empty granaries, nor could they bring rain. The burden placed upon ordinary people continued to grow.
Communities were expected to provide labor for construction projects. They paid tribute. They farmed increasingly difficult land. They repaired reservoirs damaged by years of changing weather. They supported armies when conflict erupted. Every responsibility demanded time and energy. Eventually, something had to give. In some regions, families made a quiet decision. Instead of remaining near crowded cities, struggling to support growing populations, they gathered their belongings and moved elsewhere. Not hundreds of miles away, sometimes only a short distance. A valley with better water, a smaller settlement where farmland remained available, a region less affected by political conflict. These departures happened gradually. One family left. Months later, another followed.
Then several more. The cities did not empty overnight. They slowly grew quieter. Imagine walking through one of these great capitals during this period. The temples still tower overhead. The palaces still stand proudly. But the marketplace no longer feels as crowded. A familiar craftsman's workshop sits abandoned. Weeds begin appearing between carefully laid stone pathways. A house that once echoed with children's laughter now stands silent beneath a collapsing thatched roof. Nature waits patiently. The moment people stop maintaining a building, the rainforest begins reclaiming it.
Tiny plants appear between cracks in the stone. Rainwater collects where roofs once kept everything dry. Roots slowly push deeper. Year after year, vines climb higher across forgotten walls. The jungle never hurries, it simply continues growing. Meanwhile, political authority weakened. Kings had long justified their power by maintaining harmony between the people, the gods, and the natural world. When harvests were abundant and cities prospered, that relationship seemed unquestionable. Now, difficult questions emerged. If the king truly possessed divine favor, why had the rains become so unreliable?
Why were cities struggling? Why did neighboring kingdoms continue winning battles? These questions were rarely spoken openly, but uncertainty has a way of spreading quietly through a society. Without confidence, authority becomes fragile. Some rulers attempted ambitious building projects to demonstrate that everything remained under control. Others strengthened alliances through marriage. Some launched military campaigns against old rivals. A few succeeded, many did not. Even the greatest kingdoms felt the strain. Tikal, once among the most powerful cities in the Maya world, gradually lost much of its influence. Its magnificent plazas, once filled with thousands of people, became less active with each passing generation.
Other great cities experienced similar changes. Some recovered briefly, others never fully regained their former strength. What makes this period so fascinating is that there was no single moment when the Maya civilization ended, no final battle, no one invading army sweeping across every kingdom, no emperor watching his empire collapse in a single dramatic day. Instead, different cities experienced different futures. Some declined early, others remained prosperous for many decades afterward. While one kingdom struggled, another might still flourish. The transformation unfolded across centuries, not weeks. To the people living through it, it probably did not feel like the end of a civilization. It felt like adapting to one difficult year after another. A child born during these changing times, they remembered festivals that lasted for days, merchants arriving from distant lands, temples alive with music and celebration. Those memories became stories of a time when the cities had seemed unstoppable. Yet the greatest changes were still unfolding.
Far to the north, beyond many of the struggling southern kingdoms, new Maya cities were beginning to grow in influence. While some ancient capitals faded into silence beneath the trees, others prepared to write an entirely new chapter in Maya history. The civilization was changing. It was not disappearing. Not yet. If someone had traveled through the southern Maya lowlands during the 9th century, they might have believed they were witnessing the end of a civilization. Many once great cities had grown quieter. Stone plazas that had echoed with the footsteps of thousands now stood almost empty. Temple stairways, once swept clean every morning, slowly gathered fallen leaves carried by the warm jungle breeze. The forest was beginning to reclaim places that had once seemed eternal. But history rarely follows a single path. While some cities faded, others were only beginning to rise. Far to the north, across the limestone plains of the Yucatan Peninsula, Maya communities were adapting to a very different world.
Unlike the southern rainforests, this landscape contained few rivers. Instead, fresh water collected inside deep natural sinkholes known as cenotes. These crystal-clear pools became the lifeblood of entire cities. Without them, permanent settlements would have been impossible. Generations of Maya families learned exactly where these precious sources of water could be found. Entire communities grew around them. One of the greatest of these northern cities was Chichen Itza. Long before modern travelers arrived with cameras and guidebooks, pilgrims, merchants, and ambassadors journeyed there from distant regions. As they approached the city, they would have seen broad stone roads stretching towards enormous temples rising above the flat landscape. Unlike many earlier Maya capitals hidden deep within dense forests, Chichen Itza felt more open.
Its buildings stood proudly beneath wide skies. Its plazas welcomed visitors from many different cultures. By the time the city reached its height, it had become one of the most influential places in all of Mesoamerica. Every morning, merchants entered the marketplaces, carrying goods from remarkable distances: cotton textiles, obsidian blades, salt harvested from coastal lagoons, bright macaw feathers, copper bells from lands far beyond the Maya world, honey collected from stingless bees, bundles of cacao beans so valuable that in some places they were even used in exchange for goods. The marketplace was filled with languages, accents, and unfamiliar customs.
The Maya world had always traded with its neighbors. Now those connections became even stronger. Ideas traveled alongside merchandise. Architectural styles changed. Religious traditions blended. Artists experimented with new designs inspired by distant cultures. The civilization was evolving. One building in particular dominated the skyline. Today it is often called El Castillo, though the Maya knew it by another name. Its enormous staircase climbed toward the heavens from each side, creating a perfect geometric balance that still amazes architects today.
Every angle reflected careful mathematical planning. Every stone had been placed with astonishing precision. But this pyramid was more than an impressive monument. It was a giant calendar built from stone. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the afternoon sunlight casts a remarkable pattern across the staircase. As the shadows shift, they create the illusion of a great serpent slowly descending from the temple toward the earth below. To the Maya, this was not merely an interesting visual effect. It reflected the harmony between architecture, astronomy, and religion. The builders had carefully designed the pyramid to work together with the movement of the sun itself. Such achievements remind us that Maya knowledge had not disappeared.
It continued to grow. Scholars still observed the heavens. Scribes continued recording history. Craftsmen produced magnificent sculptures and beautifully painted pottery. Children still learned the stories of their ancestors. Families still planted maize, celebrated festivals, and gathered together at the end of each day. Life had changed, but it had not ended. Another important northern city eventually rose to prominence, Mayapan. Smaller than some earlier capitals, it nevertheless became an important political center after the influence of Chichen Itza began to decline. Like many kingdoms before it, Mayapan relied upon alliances, trade, and careful diplomacy to maintain stability. Yet the same challenges that had troubled earlier generations never completely disappeared. Powerful noble families competed for influence.
Political rivalries slowly intensified. Disagreements that once seemed manageable gradually became more dangerous. History, it seemed, enjoyed repeating familiar lessons. Prosperity encouraged ambition. Ambition encouraged competition. Competition sometimes led to conflict. Even so, ordinary people continued living lives filled with familiar routines. Before sunrise, farmers still walked toward their fields. Women prepared fresh tortillas from carefully ground maize. Potters shaped clay upon simple wooden platforms. Weavers patiently transformed cotton into brightly colored cloth. Grandparents told ancient stories while children listened beneath the evening stars.
For them, civilization was not measured by the rise and fall of kings. It existed in daily life, in shared meals, in family traditions, in songs remembered across generations. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings about the Maya. People often imagine that the civilization suddenly vanished, that millions of people simply disappeared into the jungle. The truth is far quieter. The cities changed, political centers shifted, some kingdoms collapsed while others emerged, but the Maya people remained.
They continued speaking their languages. They continued farming the same land. They continued raising children beneath the same skies their ancestors had watched for thousands of years. Their civilization transformed rather than vanished. Yet another profound change was already approaching from beyond the Eastern Sea. Across the vast Atlantic Ocean, events were unfolding that no Maya astronomer, no matter how carefully they studied the heavens, could possibly have predicted. Strangers were coming.
They carried unfamiliar animals, unknown diseases, new weapons, and ideas that would reshape the Maya world more dramatically than any rivalry between neighboring kingdoms ever had.
The next chapter of their story would not begin beneath the stars they had studied for centuries. It would arrive on distant sails, appearing slowly along the horizon. For thousands of years, the Maya world had changed slowly. Cities had risen, kingdoms had fallen, families had adapted to droughts, shifting alliances, and changing landscapes. Every challenge had come from within the world they already knew. No one could have imagined that the greatest transformation would arrive from beyond an ocean they had never seen. In the early 16th century, strange stories began traveling through Mesoamerica. Travelers spoke of enormous floating houses moving across the sea.
They described pale-skinned strangers wearing shining metal armor that glimmered beneath the tropical sun. Some claimed these visitors carried sticks that roared like thunder. Others insisted they rode enormous animals unlike anything the people had ever encountered. At first, these stories sounded impossible. Surely they were exaggerations. After all, every generation produced unbelievable tales. But this time, the stories were true. The strangers were Spanish explorers and soldiers, arriving in the Americas after voyages that had begun thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. They brought with them a world entirely different from the one the Maya had known for centuries.
Steel swords, crossbows, firearms, large sailing ships, written books, and perhaps most importantly, horses. To the Maya, horses were astonishing. No such animal existed in their homeland. A mounted rider charging across an open field could appear almost supernatural to someone seeing a horse for the very first time. Yet even these unfamiliar animals were not the greatest danger. The greatest danger could not be seen at all.
Invisible diseases traveled alongside the newcomers. Smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses that had circulated for generations across Europe and Asia suddenly reached populations with no natural immunity. Entire villages became sick within weeks. Families who had survived droughts, wars, and political upheaval found themselves facing an enemy they could neither understand nor stop. Parents cared for feverish children. Healers prepared familiar medicines that had successfully treated countless illnesses before. But these diseases were different. People weakened rapidly. Many never recovered. Modern historians believe these epidemics caused enormous loss of life throughout the Americas, including among the Maya. Some communities lost large portions of their population before ever meeting a single Spanish soldier. The survivors faced a world transformed. When Spanish expeditions finally entered Maya territory, they did not encounter one united kingdom. The great classic cities had already declined centuries earlier. Instead, they found numerous independent Maya kingdoms, each with its own rulers, alliances, and rivalries. Some resisted fiercely. Others attempted diplomacy. A few hoped cooperation might protect their people. There was no single conquest. Instead, the struggle unfolded across many decades. The forests that had once witnessed conflicts between Maya kingdoms now echoed with entirely different battles. Spanish soldiers possessed advantages unfamiliar to the Maya. Steel blades remained sharp after repeated use. Metal armor offered greater protection than cotton armor. Firearms, although slow to reload, created terrifying sounds and smoke that many people had never experienced before. Yet the Maya did not surrender easily. They knew the forests better than anyone. Dense jungle slowed unfamiliar armies. Narrow paths limited the movement of horses. Local warriors adapted quickly, using the landscape to their advantage whenever possible.
Again and again, resistance continued. Some cities fell, others endured. Even after Spanish authorities spread across much of Central America, certain Maya kingdoms remained independent for generations. Deep within the forests, life continued much as it always had. Children still learned to plant maize. Families still gathered around evening fires. Priests quietly preserved ancient traditions wherever they could. One of the last independent Maya kingdoms was the kingdom of Noj Petén, centered on an island in Lake Chichen Itza in present-day Guatemala. Protected by water and surrounded by dense forests, it remained free long after many neighboring regions had come under Spanish control.
For more than a century and a half after the first European arrival in the Americas, Noj Petén continued to stand. Its rulers maintained their independence through diplomacy, careful negotiation, and determined resistance. But history continued moving forward. In 1697, Spanish forces captured the island after a difficult campaign. For many historians, this marked the end of the final independent Maya kingdom. It had been a remarkably long journey. Nearly 2,000 years had passed since the first great Maya cities began rising from the rainforest. Countless generations had lived beneath the same stars. Kings had ruled, astronomers had mapped the heavens, builders had raised magnificent pyramids, artists had carved masterpieces into stone.
Farmers had patiently cultivated maize season after season. Empires had risen elsewhere across the world. Rome had fallen. Medieval kingdoms had appeared and disappeared. Yet the Maya story had continued. Even after political independence ended, something far more important survived: the people themselves. Languages continued to be spoken. Ancient traditions quietly endured within families. Old stories were whispered from grandparents to grandchildren. Many ceremonies adapted rather than vanished. Civilizations are often remembered through their monuments.
But monuments are only stone. The true heart of any civilization lives within its people. And the Maya had not disappeared. They had endured. As the centuries passed, forests slowly reclaimed abandoned temples. Towering trees rooted themselves between ancient stones. Vines wrapped around carved monuments. Colorful birds nested where priests had once watched the sunrise. To anyone passing nearby, it seemed as though nature had erased the cities forever. Yet beneath the tangled roots and thick jungle canopy, the stone temples waited patiently, silent, hidden, and ready to tell their story once again when the world was finally prepared to listen. For nearly 2 centuries after the last independent Maya kingdom fell, the rainforest continued its quiet work. Every rainy season, tiny seeds settled into cracks between ancient stones. Their roots slowly pushed deeper. Year after year, vines climbed abandoned staircases. Towering saber trees spread their branches above forgotten temples. Birds nested inside empty palace rooms. Howler monkeys crossed rooftops that had once echoed with the footsteps of kings. Nature was not destroying the cities. It was gently wrapping them in green. To travelers passing through the jungle, these ruins became little more than strange hills covered in thick vegetation.
Some local Maya communities, however, never truly forgot them. Many still knew the old places. Ancient temples remained part of local memory, even when the outside world paid little attention. Stories continued to be passed from one generation to another. The cities were hidden, they were not forgotten. During the 19th century, explorers from Europe and North America began hearing remarkable reports of enormous stone buildings concealed beneath the forests of Central America. Some dismissed the stories as exaggerations, others were too curious to ignore them. After days, sometimes weeks of cutting through dense vegetation, they suddenly found themselves standing before towering pyramids swallowed by the jungle. The sight left many completely speechless.
Massive staircases disappeared beneath thick roots. Beautiful carvings emerged from walls covered with moss. Stone monuments still displayed the faces of kings whose names had been silent for nearly 1,000 years. It felt as though an entire civilization had been sleeping beneath the trees. At first, no one could read the carved glyphs. The monuments were admired for their beauty, but their stories remained locked away. Who were these rulers? When had they lived? Why had they built such extraordinary cities? The answers seemed impossible to find. For decades, archaeologists carefully uncovered temples one stone at a time. Artists copied the mysterious inscriptions.
Scholars compared symbols from different cities. Progress was painfully slow. Each new discovery raised even more questions. Then, during the 20th century, something remarkable happened. Researchers gradually learned how to read much of the Maya writing system. Suddenly, the silent stones found their voices again. The monuments no longer displayed anonymous faces. They revealed real people. Kings introduced themselves by name. Queens appeared beside their families. Royal children celebrated birthdays and coronations. Victories, defeats, alliances, and ceremonies emerged from inscriptions that had waited patiently for centuries.
History became personal. The Maya were no longer a mysterious civilization without names. They became individuals with ambitions, fears, achievements, and failures, much like ourselves. Archaeology also continued advancing. New technologies transformed the search for hidden cities. One of the most remarkable tools is LiDAR, a technology that uses laser pulses sent from aircraft to create detailed maps of the landscape below. Unlike ordinary photographs, these laser beams can penetrate gaps in the forest canopy. The trees remain standing, but the ground beneath them becomes visible. When researchers first used LiDAR across large areas of the Maya rainforest, the results astonished the world. Beneath the seemingly endless jungle lay far more than a handful of famous cities.
There were thousands. Roads connected distant settlements. Terraces climbed hillsides. Reservoirs stored precious water. Defensive walls surrounded important centers. Entire neighborhoods had remained hidden beneath the trees for centuries. The Maya world was far larger and more connected than historians had ever imagined. Each discovery reminds us that history is never truly finished. There are still temples waiting to be uncovered, still inscriptions waiting to be translated, still questions waiting for answers.
Perhaps somewhere beneath the rainforest, another forgotten royal tomb still rests undisturbed, preserving stories no one has heard for over 1,000 years. Yet
the greatest legacy of the Maya is not found inside buried pyramids. It lives in people. Today, millions of Maya men, women, and children continue living across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They speak dozens of Maya languages. They celebrate traditions whose roots stretch back countless generations. They weave colorful textiles using patterns passed from ancestors. They cultivate maize in fields that have fed their communities for centuries. The civilization did not vanish. It transformed. Empires may rise.
Kingdoms may fall. Cities may become quiet, but cultures often endure in ways that stone monuments never can. And perhaps that is the true lesson of the Maya. Their greatest achievement was not simply building magnificent pyramids or creating astonishing calendars. It was the resilience of ordinary people. Farmers who patiently planted maize every season, craftsmen who shaped beauty from stone and clay, parents who passed knowledge to their children, grandparents who kept old stories alive beneath the evening stars. Those quiet acts of memory carried the Maya farther through history than any king ever could.
As our journey through ancient Mesoamerica gently comes to an end, the rainforest grows quiet once more. The evening breeze moves softly through the leaves. Moonlight rests upon weathered limestone. Somewhere in the darkness, a howler monkey calls across the forest, just as it did 1,000 years ago. The great cities no longer bustle with merchants or rulers. Their plazas have become peaceful. Their temples stand patiently beneath the sky, asking for nothing except to be remembered. And perhaps, as you slowly drift towards sleep, you'll remember that history is rarely a story of things simply disappearing.
More often, it is a story of change, of endurance, of people adapting to a world that never stops changing. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through the rise and fall of the Maya civilization. Rest well, and until our next journey into the past, good night.